So good evening and welcome back to Chasing Lullabies. It's lovely to see you, and thank you all of those that are able to make it this evening. I know there are other competing demands on people's time, so it's really wonderful to see you here this evening. Of course, a lot of people do watch it on catch up, which is always lovely to hear about. And anyone who is watching it on catch up, please feel free to get in touch to discuss any questions that might come up that you weren't able to participate with in person during the actual live session. Tonight's session, Parashas Mishpatim, which is what we just read in Shul, I think marks a fundamental change in the sequence of Torah storytelling or Torah narrative until this point. Until this point in the Torah, we've essentially been dealing with stories or history. We've been dealing with the creation of the world, Noah, patriarchs, through to Joseph, through to slavery, and then the story of the Exodus, all the way into the Torah being given at Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments we talked about last week. And now we're up to a point where the book changes, it seems, to change focus. It seems that this is the first time where we look at Torah as law, just law, not L-O-R-E, but L-A-W, because Mishpatim, statutes, laws, rules, ordinances, whatever English translation one wants to use, is the first time that we now have codified in a more systematic form, not just the overarching principles, the 10 commandments, but actually just law upon law upon law upon law, criminal law, civil law, tort law, whatever it is, slavery law. That those now become the main body of this week's Torah portion. And then the finale of the Torah portion is the famous moment when the Jews accept the Torah with the statement Na'aseh v'nishma, we'll do and we'll understand. And there is a berit, there is a covenant that is wrought between the Jewish people and God. But up until that point, the vast body of Mishpatim is all about laws. And so I think before we jump into the material this evening, I think it would be interesting to share together how we sort of read sections of Torah, and they'll be coming thick and fast after this point. But this really is the first, I think, major movement from narrative structure into law structure, how we read the Torah with the law, L-A-W, parts of the Torah. How do we think about it? How do we feel about it? And what does it make us sort of feel as we transition from narrative through to law? So I just want to throw the questions open. I could maybe answer the question in a more pointed way, which is, does anyone feel like they're really reading two different books when they read the Torah? At least two different books woven into one. There's one book which is the story or history of the Jewish people, and there's one book which is the laws of the Jewish people. And never the twain shall meet, never the two shall meet, that there is really just two different ways of two different parts of the book. And some authorities would even have you believe that this is because there are multiple authors of the Torah, and they'll point to these thematic changes as evidence of different authors. How do you read the Torah when you come to a point of such divergence in theme?
So I think that the point that I take from where it goes into all the detail of the laws and the backwards and forwards and everything, and that is that without the context of the story part, then you wouldn't be able to accept the law part. So, you know, if you were given as Jews a book of the Torah which had just, you're going to do this, you've got to do this, you know, you've got to cut your meat in a certain way and kill it like this and drain it like this and do it like this and do it like that, you'd say, yeah, why? So the fact is that you need the context of the historical figures and what they went through and their relationships with God in order to, sorry for the noise in the background, but in order to make sense of why we accept the rest of it and the context of the rest of it.
Okay, so you're saying that the stories lay the groundwork to allow us to accept the laws. But is it more like that? Therefore, the story is about trust or about faith in the process of law? Is that the idea?
No, I don't. There's certainly trust. Trust, yes, because that otherwise, why would you believe? If you were just given a set of laws without the whole thing of the patriarchs and the Exodus and all of the history that meant that the laws came to us, then there'd be no reason for you to accept the laws. So there's a context and a trust. I'm not. I don't. What was the other bit that you said was what there?
I suppose I'm wondering. You're saying that the stories give us the backdrop within which then the laws can be, I don't know, located or described, but
not located, but almost accepted. Almost accepted. Why would you do something with, if God came to you and said, right, here you are, guys, you're going to
everybody, it is Reverend David Foreman, and
I don't know what that was. You're going to not do anything on a Shabbat, and you're going to kill your food in a certain way. You're not going to eat this bird, and you're not going to eat that insect or whatever. Never mind what everybody else does. It wouldn't mean anything to you unless you had a history behind it that explained to you why this is important and what it has meant to your people in the past, and why why you are a part of this. Otherwise, it's just a set of do's and don'ts. So
so this is giving us.
I would see it as it's not that it's a backdrop that kind of that puts the stories in the background. Having the stories without the laws doesn't work, because that's why other races and nations have not survived. They've not had any laws to keep them and to keep. They've only had the stories behind them. Okay, and if you've got a story about your gladiator or your this or your that or your Caesar, what's that going to do for you later on? It's just a story in the past. So you need the laws to keep that, but at the same time, if you only have the laws, there's no context for them and no historical background as to why you should keep them.
Okay. So it's almost like you're weaving the laws themselves into some sort of narrative structure in order to embed them better within this tribe or nation, that they become more easily or properly held by virtue of the fact that they are coming from a narrative structure, not just either a story without laws or laws without stories. I suppose I'm wondering then, if that were the case, that we really want them to be embedded within our history, should the laws somehow mirror the history or talk to the history? Like, how does the laws of chattel and your rights of your maidservant what does that have to do with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, other than the fact that they're both in the same book?
It's to do with, okay, so there are certain things that you can pull back. So the laws of how you treat your maidservant and your manservant or whatever come from a moral standpoint that you should that is given the context by the way the patriarchs behaved, and by the way some other people didn't behave, and that means that there is a link between the two. And then there are other things which are simply these are the things that are given to us. They're not given to everybody. They're given to us for reasons that sometimes we understand and sometimes we have no idea about whatsoever. But the fact that they're given to us is we will accept them because we accept everything else, rather than picking and choosing. You don't say, right, well, you know what, I like Pesach, I'll do Pesach, but this whole business with the para aduma, the red heifer and everything, that's just weird, so I don't want to do that, and I'll just do the bits I like. Because then you end up, without having a real go at any particular sector of the community, you end up with a liberal type of Judaism where you can pick and choose, and in the end you pick less and less and less, and you end up without a foundation that continues.
Okay, so I think that Joe has given us a grand structure whereby,
sorry about that.
No, it's good. Whereby as far as if I'm getting it correctly, Joe, the stories themselves give historical, not just context, but also sort of personal context for each and every one of us to locate these laws within our own story, within our own history. And as such, they allow the laws to sort of become family values rather than just sort of pick and choose a list. And so by giving them the family context, they become family values. Is that maybe what you're saying, Joe?
To a degree, I think that, but we have the choice of what we do with that. I think everybody has a favorite Torah story, Bible story, whether it's the flood or whether it's Pesach going out, or whether it's the 10 plagues, or whether it's Jacob's driving with the angel. Everybody's got a bit they think, oh, you know what, I like that bit. But then whether you choose to look into that and decide that, what does that actually mean? What is it relevant to in other parts of Judaism, or is it just a story? That's what people choose for themselves. And so yes, there will be people who say, no, it's just a story. It doesn't have any context for the laws, but I think that it can have. And I think if you read it in a particular way, it will have.
Okay. Is there anyone else that wants to chip in and jump in?
Somebody, please.
Yeah. I look at it sort of similarly, but differently, if you don't like. I mean, until now, we've had a story of a group of people, of a nation that got bigger and bigger, and the history of the forefathers and going down to Egypt and slavery and the Exodus and all the rest of it. But the next part of the story, if you like, is the becoming a country, becoming a nation, going into the land. And in order to keep that nation together, they had to have a structure, and the structure is the laws. Because otherwise it'd just be, they'd had all this history before, but they were growing and growing and getting bigger and bigger. And if they weren't kept together by the laws, they would just disperse, and there wouldn't be a nation, there wouldn't be a Jewish people, if you like. And I think that's part of the reason why it's come in now at this point in the story, if you like.
And so Rena's seeing it as a natural progression from family to nation, that we've gone through.
On a simplistic, yes, in a simple form, yes.
That's why I'm a simple man. I've got to take your complex ideas and try and put them into pithy statements. So that's and so actually it's almost like those are two sides of they're two different approaches. That Joe's approach is we locate the laws within family in order to give them that sort of a sentence of family values that are part of a personal narrative. And Rena's the other way is sort of saying that they go beyond the family, they become the national, they become the nation, and that's actually a question of going from family to nation, which is why we're moving from a series of stories into a much more legalistic system. It's the demands of that moment, as we've changed from this small group of 70 people going down to Egypt to millions of people going out into the desert, ready to become a sovereign in their own land. Therefore, they're going to need a different relationship to how they relate to obligation, for example. And maybe the opportunity for tonight's Chasing Lullabies is to see a bit of both, to see how the laws of Mishpatim, whilst yes, they are the laws for a fledgling nation. So again, whilst they are laws for a fledgling nation, they're also rooted in our stories. That the way that they're presented shows that the history of all the different vicissitudes, all the different struggles that our ancestors went through as a family were then expressed and given form in a legal code that matched what their experiences were. It's almost like the patriarchs became and the stories of Genesis become the models that we need to observe and learn the lessons from in a codified legal system. That's the hypothesis that we'll share with you this evening. And we'll explore together. And I want to see how it lands. And it's really sort of a new thought to me that sort of really binds together the narrative parts of the Torah with the legalistic parts of the Torah, to say that the legalistic parts of the Torah are the natural outgrowth of what happened to these characters, what happened to these people. So without further ado, let's take an example from this week's Torah portion from Mishpatim, from the laws that are there, and see if there's any sort of flavors, anything that the text might be indicating to us, links Mishpatim on the one hand to the stories of our forefathers, the family stories in Genesis on the other. And once again, just to thank, I'm sorry, the cough's got really bad today. To thank Rabbi David Foreman from Aleph Beta for the material that we'll be looking at today. And so I'm going to share screen and jump into a verse in Parashat Mishpatim. So here we go. One of the verses in Parashat Mishpatim should be coming up on your screen. And it says in Exodus 21, verses 12 to 14, Makeish v'ameis, most you must. Someone who strikes a person such that he dies shall surely be put to death. V'asher lo tzada v'ha Elohim ina liyado, but one who did not lie in wait, meaning it wasn't premeditated murder. Rather, it was an accidental death. So, v'Elohim ina liyado, it was God who brought it into his hands, so to speak. It was God who orchestrated the situation. Someone's climbed up a ladder and they've got a bucket of water they're using to clean the windows, and their hand slips, they drop the bucket, and the bucket tragically it lands just perfectly right on the forehead of the person below, and that's the end of them. So it's sort of like a God orchestrating this, but the person themselves being the tool for this orchestration. So I'll prepare for them a place that they can run away to. That's the cities of refuge. But however, but if a person does plot in advance, it's premeditated murder to kill their friend. To kill him with a plan. With here it says with cunning, with a plan, with trickery. Even from my altar, you shall take him to die. Even if he's engaged in holy activity, take him out to die. A murderer, meaning someone who's got premeditated intent, they should be taken out to die. Okay, those are basic verses of the legal system of intentional and unintentional murder. We might not call it murder if it's unintentional. We might call it the laws of murder and manslaughter. Now, if you were to write the verses, would you have written them in the form that we find them in over here? Is there anything strange about the order of the verses that you see before you? An internal question, a question about the text. Anything strange about the order of the verses?
It seems very strange that it starts with the sentence that if one strikes a man, he'll be put to death. Surely he'll be put to death. But then goes on to say, oh, but if he didn't mean to do it, then he's going to have a place to hide. And then it goes back to say that, well, if he planned it, then you're going to hold him accountable.
Absolutely. So there's a perfect insight over there, Francis, that normally you'd say the rule and then the exception to the rule. We're talking about putting a murderer to death. That means the rule is that if you're a murderer, you have intent. So the first verse, verse 12, should then be followed by verse 14, the rule. And only afterwards would you follow with the exception to the rule, which is, and if, sorry, that if you didn't, if you didn't have intent, then there is a different outcome for you. So there's something, this pricks up our ears when we see something like this. It suggests that there is something afoot here. There's something within these verses that is a little bit strange. We should first have the rule and only then have the exception to the rule. So I think the suggestion, therefore, the one that Rabbi Foreman makes and that we'll share this evening, is that maybe the Torah uses our history, our family stories, as a kind of sort of raw material which we use to shape our laws. And therefore the answer as to why the verses are presented in the way that they are is that we are presenting these verses not in the logical expression, but rather in the historical expression, the historical order. There was a historical event which went from rule to exception to rule, rather than from rule to exception. And we're mirroring that because the laws of the Torah are a natural outpouring of the history of the Torah. So there is a certain story where the exception came before the rule, where the case of killing without intent came before the case of the killing with intent. And that's why Mishpatim puts it like that. Now, is there such a story? Is there such a story? Well, we have to look at the verbs used in these verses, and they may give us a clue. And so I want to go back to the verse that we just saw and put it back onto the screen. And I want to pull up two different words that are sort of relatively interesting and unusual words to describe the act of murder. Okay, so here we go. So just back to that verse. And it says over here, a person who kills another person, they'll be put to death. But one who did not, literally, it's tzada, one who did not hunt. So the first unusual, I think, language over here is someone who didn't hunt somebody else. You might not use that language quite frequently. You don't not necessarily think about people hunting other people. In actual fact, you think at the last verse, it doesn't talk about hunting, it talks about trickery, cunning. Someone who's not cunning. So then it happened as an accident. So then the following happens. And someone who is cunning, so then they get put to death. So if you wanted to make a mirror between verse 13 and verse 14, it would say Va'asher loy halach ba'arama, or someone who didn't go with cunning, versus someone who went to kill with cunning. So that's the first interesting thing, the language of hunting. The second a second language, which is a remarkable word, which is only ever found one other place in the Torah, is v'chi yazid. If he, and how's it translated over here? If he plots, yazid, there's a plot, from the language of mazid, of having an intent. But the yazid ish arehi, if he's plotting against someone, and then it says laharge ba'arama, to murder with cunning. Again, there seems to be a bit of a redundancy here. Once again, it's a very internal question. But if you look at the words of the verse, if he's plotting, we know he's doing it ba'arama, we know he's doing it with cunning. There's two different words here, one plotting and one for cunning. It's almost like you don't really need the word yazid. You don't really need the word he did it with intent, because we already know that he's gone to kill with arama, with trickery. So once again, there's something which is a bit strange over here. And I think these two words, the trapping and the yazid, will lead us into a story that we haven't seen for a little while. Does anyone have a thought what that story might be? A place where there is a possibility of murder, both intentional and unintentional, where there's some hunting and also yazid or nazid that is involved. Any clues, any thoughts?
Either Cain and Abel or Jake, or I've forgotten the other two for the minute.
Go on, you were there, Francis, on the tip of your tongue.
It's on the tip of my tongue and I can't get them out.
Jacob and
Esau.
Right. Okay. So Jacob and Esau. So we might get a Cain and Abel a bit later, but we definitely have a Jacob and Esau, because what is the language that was used to describe when Jacob came in from the fields and when Esau came in from the fields and he was very, very hungry? There's only one other time where there's a word that appears like this in the Torah. It's in Genesis 25:29. Let me pull that up for you. And it's really quite a stark thing when you see it. So Genesis 25:29. Let me pull up the screen share. Tony Robinson's cunning plan. Yeah, I love cunning plans from Tony Robinson. He went to the school of cunning. Okay, Genesis 25:29. Here we go. So, Vayazed Yaakov Nazid, that very language of Yazed and Nazid. Once when Jacob was cooking Yazed, he's cooking a Nazid, a stew. Vayava Esav min hasadeh, and Esau came in from the field for Ayef, and he was very tired. Remarkable that the language in Mishpatim to describe intentional murder is somehow linked to the only other time in the Torah we find this Yazed language, when Jacob is cooking a stew for Esau. Okay, That's interesting. Well, what do we do with that? What was going on over there? Esau's coming from a long, hard day out in the fields. He's hungry, he's tired, and he smells Jacob's lentil stew simmering on the fire, and he wants some of it. Give me some of that. And he'll even sell his birthright. Or rather, Jacob says, if you sell me your birthright, I'll give you some of that stew. And Esau sells his birthright. Now, what does lentil stew have to do with murder? It's not necessarily evident right now, immediately, but there might be a link. Well, let's see. The other word that we saw in this verse in Mishpatim was Sadah. He's killed without Sadah, without trapping him. We said it's a bit interesting. You don't normally use the word of trapping. You'd maybe use the opposite of harama. Where else do we have a language of trapping? So back into the story of Esau and Jacob, and we do have a language of trapping in the next chapter. So let's pull that up over here. Here we go. So chapter 27, the next chapter on after this, 3 and 4, verses 3 and 4. Here we go. This is Isaac speaking to Esau, and he's about to give his blessings. Take your gear, your quiver, and your bow. Go out into the field and trap something for me. Hunt for me some game. And make for me tasty things, like I love. And bring them to me, and I will eat them. So that I can bless you before I die. Now, there's two things that cause Esau to sort of lose the two different contributing moments that cause Esau to lose the blessings that he really wants. The first is that he sold the birthright. He's the yazed, the nazid, the lentils. The second thing is that he's had to go out to hunt the game. Which has given an opportunity for Jacob to come in. Back in 1 second, I need a tissue. Apologize for the splutting. So there's some language here which is linking us to Jacob and Esau, but there's the themes are sort of linking us as well. So was there anyone in the Jacob and Esau story who had murderous intent? Someone who is waiting to kill somebody else? Well, there was a person like that. It was Esau. Because remember what happens right at the end of the Jacob story after the blessings have been stolen. So we go back into our verses and we go right to the end of the story of the blessings being stolen. And in verse 41, here is Jacob. Now, Esau harbored a grudge against Jacob about the blessing that his father had given him. And Esau said in his heart, my father's going to die soon. And then I'll kill Esau, my brother. So now we don't just have the motive, we also have the plan. With we have the reason behind, the reason pushing Esau on is that he lost his birthright, and we now have an explicit planned motive that is linking us not just textually but thematically to the verses in Mishpatim. So Esau is a really good paradigm of someone who's plotting a murder in advance, because if you think about it, therefore Esau's murderous intent has been bubbling along and building for decades, because it didn't start with the stolen blessing. If the verse is telling us that there was a yazid and nazid that was, so by the way, what you realize here is that, so if the verse is telling us there was a yazid and nazid, a lentil stew, that was the first precipitating event for this murderous intent, it tells us that all the way from the very beginning, all the way from the lentil stew, Esau's hatred of Jacob began. And that was part of the reason why he wants to kill him. By the way, what I'm doing now in this interpretation is I'm not just looking at the stories of the historical narrative, the stories of the family, telling us something about Mishpatim, telling us something about the laws that we found in this week's Torah portion. We're also looking at the laws of Mishpatim, the words there, teaching us something retroactively about what was happening but was happening back in the day with our forefathers, right? Because the very structure of the verses in Mishpatim, which use this special language of Yazid, hate, planning, link into the stew story to tell us that the planning, the paradigmatic case of someone who was churning away with his murderous intent for many years, that's Esau. How do you know? Because he's a Yazid. What's Yazid? That's the stew. It happened all the way with the stew many years before the case of the blessings. And then it hits the fan with the blessings with the language of trapping. And then there is that intent, that murderous intent. Now, in Esau's case, it never actually happened. He didn't actually go through with the murder. But it's as if the Torah in Mishpatim is telling us, do you know what it means to have intent to kill, to plan a murder? Look at the case of Esau, who hated his brother Jacob for many decades. That's what it means to lie in wait. Now, we have dealt with something about that story, which is about the intentional part. What about the reverse? Do we have someone who commits a crime without full intent, unintentionally, so to speak? Someone who might even come before this finale of murderous intent. Who is that person who's engaged in doing something wrong, but maybe without so much forethought? Who's that?
Rebecca.
Well, Rebecca's she's thinking about it, but there's someone else, another protagonist here, who she's influencing, who probably isn't thinking as much as she is about it. He's just going along with the ride.
Rebecca is influencing Jacob.
That's right.
And
So
giving him the wherewithal.
That's right. So Jacob is the one who is present, but not necessarily fully planning. Rebecca might have planned, but Jacob isn't really planning. And I can't remember whether we said it at the time in Genesis when we were doing Chasing Lullabies then, but certainly there is a way to read those verses that there was never really, even from Rebecca's perspective, an intention to trick Isaac. Instead, she wanted to set up a situation which would allow Jacob to be the best person that he could be, to share his capacity to take charge of a situation and to assert himself before his father. And what happened was it didn't quite go to plan, and because the plan wasn't to deceive. So it's an unintentional deception. It's an unintentional deception of the father. So even though the sin is the sin, lying to one's father is a sin, it was an unintentional one. And that gives us the verse out of order. The Asher Lo Tzada, the one who did not trap. Who didn't trap? Well, Jacob didn't trap because he wasn't out in the field trapping the food. His brother was out in the field trapping the food. He was walking in with the slaughtered goat, not really knowing what was going to happen, maybe with his mother thinking he might fess up and say, look, it's me, it's Jacob, but I am also deserving of the birthright. And instead, he lied. And that's why maybe in Mishpatim, we have that verse, the exception to the rule, when there's lacking intent, before the point where there is intent, because Esau only has the full concretized intent for murder right at the end after this moment. And notice that just as in the law in Mishpatim, where there is a murderer without intent, what's the answer? What's the response? What do we do for this manslaughterer? We let him run away. What happens to Jacob after he's deceived his father? He has to run away to Father Laban, to Uncle Laban. So the similarities are a little bit too eerie to ignore. And as we said, that these similarities tell us something about both parts of the story. They don't just tell us something about Mishpatim, that Mishpatim is a series, but they work both ways. So let's think about that. The first way to think about this is to say that the laws of Mishpatim, the laws of this nation, aren't simply a series of collected wisdom that we need now as we're becoming a much bigger sovereign state. We're about to have our own country. They're the
Hi, is
accumulated.
that Leila?
Hello, Jonathan.
That's okay.
They're the accumulated wisdom of tried and tested or experiences that our forefathers went through, which then get codified into law. And we've talked about this idea in the past that by our actions, now we can redeem the mistakes of the past. And we saw that when we were looking in Chasing Lullabies in Genesis, as the same mistakes repeated from generation to generation, testing each generation with the same things over and over again. And it was either, do you repeat or do you do the opposite? Are you able to fix what happened in the past? So do we, as the children of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and all the way back to the patriarchs, can fix what they did in the past by learning from their mistakes or learning from their experiences and then putting that into a codified system of law. And therefore Mishpatim are laws that come out from family experiences. The second thing, though, is that these family experiences, these laws tell us something back about how God, so to speak, is judging what happened in the past. Because if you think about what happened with the Jacob and Esau story, it sort of ends rather abruptly. We don't really know who's the villain, who's not. We're not really given much messages about how to interpret it. What do we make of Jacob in this? Was it as terrible as it all seems? And that there is some, therefore, suggestion that Torah does look at Jacob's act with something of a critical lens, because it's looking at him as in the category of a sinner, but a sinner without intent. Nevertheless, yes, despite causing a great deal of pain, he didn't mean to do it. He didn't plan it. It just sort of happened. And so there's a little bit of exoneration there as well. If this is the case, then this could be the beginning of a much larger pattern that sort of gives color and animation to many more of the laws in the Torah. That many more of the laws in the Torah are not just a list of the Judaism's best attempt at civil and criminal law, but rather they're a divine response to our history. And they actually give us the opportunity to live out a perfected version of that history. Perhaps they were the mistakes that needed to happen in order that we have the opportunity to correct them. So that I'm going to pause at this point in time to hear your thoughts, sort of questions and reflections on this before we might be able to take it one stage further for the final part of Chasing Lullabies. Any thoughts?
I can see the analogy that you're drawing, or the references, but the laws are actually cementing it, aren't they? Really, they're putting it down now in like concrete. So you may not have got that from the story, you may have looked at the story, but in order for it to actually be a law, it's got to be formulated. I mean, you can't go into a court with a story. You've got to go in with the actual statute, so to speak. So it's been codified.
Yes, it is codified, but it's codifying a piece of our past. It's not codifying just an idea. This is a clever thing to have a fair society. It's codifying a piece of our past, a foible of our past, into a law that is one through experience rather than just simply being a good idea.
But
so I think
all the laws. I mean, okay, you've quoted this very simplistic, not simplistic, it's the wrong word, but very obvious the story of Jacob and Esau and the hunting and the premeditated murder. And that's a very kind of clear and obvious law about premeditated murder and unpremeditated murder. But if you read the whole Seder of Mishpatim, there are loads and loads and loads of laws. And do all of them refer to things that have happened before? I mean, you know, about slavery, and I can't remember all of them, obviously, but there are loads of them. There's one after the other, and I think all relating to things that had happened in the history.
Well, so that would be the tantalizing possibility, is that we've given one example of that. Could we give any more? Could we see if slavery could be linked to stories of slavery that happened before? There's been at least 2 stories of slavery up until now. There's been the story of the Egyptians enslaving the Jewish people, or the Israelites, but there's also the story of Joseph being taken into slavery after his brothers sold him. So, you know, that's interesting. I wonder what we could do with that. And if we, there might be a possibility of us looking into that right now. But yes, Rena, ideally, then this wouldn't just be one isolated cute example that seems to work out quite nicely with, you know, a weird outline of the verses and some textual links and some thematic links. But that's, you'd have to really, for this hypothesis to stand the test, it would have to be more broadly appropriate and applied. So yeah, I agree with you there. Any other thoughts before we maybe unpack a little bit more of what Rena is suggesting we might be able to do? Okay, so here's the invitation. Let's get back into our parasha, back into Exodus, and a little bit before, let me screen share with you. So a little bit before the verses that we've just read together about murder, there are other verses as well. So here were the verses about murder, 12 to 14. Someone who fatally strikes a person, you can put them to death, etc., etc., is out of order. So there are other laws over here. Let me just find what I'm trying to do. 1 second. Sorry, I'm going to stop the share just for a second. I'm losing my bearings over here for a sec. Well, sorry, it's 2 verses later. Was going the wrong way. So 2 verses after the laws that we just saw of murder. So we also have someone who kidnaps another person, whether he sold him or is still holding him, shall be put to death. Okay, that's interesting. Someone who kidnaps somebody else shall be put to death. Do we have any stories about someone kidnapping somebody else? Well, yes, we do have the story of someone being kidnapped and then being sold. That happened in the story of Joseph and his brothers. And it actually happens chronologically after the stories that were echoed in the previous verses. So the previous verses were maybe reminiscent of the stories of Jacob and Esau. Well, 2 verses later, we have a verse which is reminiscent of the sale of Jacob. And Jacob and Esau happened before the sale of the sale of Joseph. The Jacob and Esau happened before the sale of Joseph. And actually, if you think about it, there are actually connections between the story of Jacob and Esau on the one hand and the story of Joseph on the other. And here we bring back our famous goats and coats, because there are goats and coats in the story of Jacob and Esau, because it was a goat that was slaughtered to provide the food for Isaac in the time of the blessings, and it was Esau's coat that Jacob went in wearing in order to pretend that he was his brother. There were also goats and coats in the story of Joseph and his brothers, as there was a goat that was slaughtered to dip Joseph's famous, not technicolor necessarily, dream coat into the blood, and then show that to his father to deceive him and pretend that he'd been killed by a lion or something. Sort of interesting that not only is there a chronological progression from the verses in Mishpatim dealing with murder reminiscent of Jacob and Esau to the chronological progression to the verses reminiscent of Joseph and his brothers, but also a sort of a thematic connection that they're linked with the goats and the coats. And so if the Torah is really sort of like a raw material, if the Torah is a sort of using the raw material of our patriarchs and our history and our stories to then create laws, so then we are also maybe going ahead with how those stories played forward and giving us a sequence to the laws in Mishpatim itself. Okay. Let me just take this further for a second. So it's interesting. What does it mean in the verse that we looked at? Gonev ish umacharo. It says in that verse in Mishpatim, if somebody steals a person and then is sold. Sort of interesting, by the way, the word gonev, to steal a person, is used specifically with reference to Joseph. Joseph complains when he's in the dungeon. He says, "Ganov gunavti mibeis ivrim." I was stolen from the hands of the Hebrews. Just as the Torah is actually using the same word that Joseph used to describe what happened to him. I was ganov. I was stolen, and he was sold as well. And then the same word used in the sale is v'nimtza v'yado, is found in his hand. So the problem of course is here is, what does it mean it's found in his hand? How could that even be? So the perpetrator acts, so like if Bob goes and kidnaps Steve and then sells him, then nimtza b'yado, what does it mean that he's found in Bob's hand? He's not found in the hand. Bob sold him. So Bob sold Steve to somebody else. It'll be in someone else's hand. What do you mean nimtza b'yado? It's found in his hand. He doesn't have him anymore. So Rashi is bothered by this in the verse in Mishpatim. And just to have a look at that over here together, let's just one more time screen share, and just maybe to bring it together. Look at this verse in Mishpatim. The going of ish umacharo, the nimtza v'yado mosumah. Someone who steals somebody else, who kidnaps a person and sells him, the nimtza v'yado. So he's found in his hand. Why is it found in his hand? He's sold. So Rashi gets involved over here and says, where does it say the nimtza v'yado? Implies that witnesses have seen him stealing and also saw him selling the person, and that he has been found in his possession before he sold him. Okay, so that's interesting. So someone is watching the sale. Someone is aware of the sale occurring. Sort of interesting, isn't it? Well,
Are you, sorry, I don't know whether you want to carry on with this train or whether you want an interruption.
Let me just finish this thought and then
Sure. Yeah, that's okay.
So Rashi sort of is telling us that the verse is out of order. It should have said that the gonev ish v'nimtza v'yado mecharo. It should have, if someone kidnapped somebody else and then it was found in his hand, and only then did he sell it. So we caught him red-handed, and that's why Rashi says there was testimony because it was the way that he was caught red-handed. That's why he'd be liable. But the verse is sort of out of order. But if you go back to the story that the Torah might be pulling it from, it actually sort of makes sense, because think about the Joseph story. Gonev ish, stealing a person, that would be kidnapping him. Then mecharo would be to sell him. Or what happens after that? Think about the word matzah, the root matzah, to find. Do you ever find the root matzah find in the Joseph story? And yes, we do, because when the brothers come to their father and they have the coat and they present it to the father, they say, Zos matzanu, we found this. And that happens afterwards. And so even though in the chronology of Mishpatim, it's sort of out of order, normally you're found red-handed before selling it rather than after selling it. That's why Rashi has to say, yeah, there were witnesses. In the context of the Joseph story, it's in order, because they were only found out, so to speak, after the sale. Joe, what did you want to say?
I'm not sure whether it's relevant, but are you specifically selecting that kidnap story because of the sale part?
I'm looking at the kidnap story because it seems to match the law in Mishpatim.
Right, as opposed to previous kidnaps in the Torah, such as Lot Lot was kidnapped, and you could argue that Sarah was kidnapped into the taken into the kingdom. So are you using this one specifically because of the kidnap and sale bit, or?
Well, I suppose you're right. There are other kidnap opportunities. I'm looking at it as something that happened after what might have been a reflection of the earlier piece, might be a reflection in this later piece because it's a later story. But you're right. It's again that I would say that tonight's presentation is more like a really tantalizing possibility. I haven't necessarily nailed it down. Something
That's fine.
fun.
That's fine. I'm not trying to. This is not a question. I'm not trying to catch you out with one that doesn't fit. I was asking whether it was whether it was specifically because it fitted that way that you were picking on that one, or there are other elements of the kidnap stories or kidnap and rescue or what, I don't know. I haven't thought that through.
Okay. So let's just finish off some of these maybe broader brushstrokes and see again whether that might help Joe with explaining why we're relating it to these stories in particular. That if the Torah is really pulling out from these stories and giving us some sort of law around it. So when the Torah is sort of telling us that theoretically, if a person was to steal somebody else, was a person to kidnap, then they should be put to death. Well, then they would get the death penalty. And the Torah is sort of using our history to shape and create these laws. And because we know that was something that was that the brothers risked, that Joseph was almost put their lives at danger when he was the masked stranger in Egypt, as almost like a response to them having kidnapped him in the past. And it might even be that the surrounding verses in Mishpatim seem to add an additional flavor. So back into Mishpatim, there's another verse over there, which is also seemingly might link up to some of the things that we've been discussing over here, because we missed out a verse in the middle. There's two verses that bracket the conversation that we're having at the moment, and those might also have something to share. A verse beforehand was Umake aviv ve'ima mosuma, someone who strikes their father and mother shall surely be put to death. And the verse afterwards is Mekalel aviv ve'ima mosuma, someone who curses their father and mother shall be put to death. Now, is there anything within the stories of either Jacob and Esau or the stories of Joseph and his brothers that deal with striking or cursing a parent and a possible death blow? So think of Goats and Coats 1 and Goats and Coats 2. Does it remind you of anything? If there's any blow against father and against mother, well, you go back to Goats and Coats 1, and what's Rebecca? What's Rebecca doing over there? Now, Francis talked about Rebecca. Rebecca says, you better run away because I can't bear to lose both of you on the same day. So it would be as if I miscarried you both. If I'd lose you, it'd be a terrible thing. And Rebecca then goes even further and says, if you go and if you marry somebody from the land of Canaan, someone that is not fitting for you to marry, well, right after the story of the deception, she says this to Jacob. So it would be as if I was dead. It would be like, you're killing me. So I suppose if you strike your mother and father, that's a capital crime too. The Torah is sort of playing off these ideas. So that the Rebecca is at the denouement of at the end of the piece of the Jacob and Esau deception. She says, if you want me to go to my grave, then if you strike me with the choice of a marriage partner, which is not to our liking, which is not a Jewish or a Jewishly inclined marriage partner, whatever that meant at that time, so then you're going to strike me and I'm going to die. And that seems again to be finding its way out into Mishpatim possibly. Similarly, Mekalel aviv ve'imo, cursing one's father and mother. What does that remind you of? Do we have any of that in Goats and Coats? Well, remember what Rebecca says when she tries to entice Jacob. Jacob is reluctant to go into his father. What if father sees what I'm doing and thinks I'm deceiving him? Right? So Avesi alai klala v'lo bracha, and he'll curse me rather than bless me. So what does she say? Alai kilasecha b'ni, your curse shall be upon me, my son. A case of cursing mother. The Torah is playing with that also. There's also that sort of element. What am I saying? I'm saying that there seems to be some strange connections, some strange linkages between the stories of the past, the goats and goats 1, the goats and goats 2, the cursing of a parent to through to the striking of a parent, the intentional and unintentional plans for sin or for death, and also the sale and kidnap of a person. They all seem to be starting to link back to some of our history. And therefore, really, what both Rena and Joe said at the beginning seems to be both true when it comes to the structure of law. We need law as a nation, but we also need to be rooted in family and history. How do you get law that is both national and taking us on to the next level, but is rooted in our family and history? Is when the laws are constructed and scaffolded directly into the history of our forefathers. That the early experiences of family Israel becomes the formal structure of law for nation Israel. And we see that possibly in the linkages there between Mishpatim and the rest. The other thing I think it does is that when we start to walk into these verses, these parashios of law, we're not just walking into a new chapter, something which is entirely distinct and separate from the past. We're walking into the formal iteration or the formal formulation of an informal, hard-earned history. We're walking into the legalistic code that has come out of the shared experiences that our forefathers had to bear and had to be trialed with. That, I think, is a really powerful thought, that we can go away and read those verses and really be curious about further connections together. Maybe Rena find even more connections as we continue on that exploration. Thank you so much for joining me this evening on Chasing Lullabies and for chasing away the lullabies with me. Any thoughts, questions, and comments will be really welcome.
As a lawyer, that's quite fascinating. I'll have to look at the English law and look back at English history and see if I can find any similarity.
Well, it is a bit reminiscent of our laws of precedent, isn't it?
Yeah. I suppose it is. It's case law in its most sort of beautiful way, that the case is a historical moment of a family trying to fumble through the ups and downs of life. That's the case which then forms the basis for a formalized expression of law. Yeah. Lovely to see you all this evening. I will see you very soon. Everyone should be well.
Wish a cough better.
Thank you very much.